Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final event in the Breaking Point series, Tackling Racism in North Carolina. I'm KRISTIN Roberts, Vice President of News for McClatchy. Perhaps you're watching us via the homepage of the Charlotte Observer, or you're joining us after seeing a tweet from the News and Observer, or you saw an email from our opinion editor. However you found us today, thank you for joining. George Floyd's death has ignited weeks of protests across America, and indeed around the world. Our journalists have stood witness to these events, recording the voices of this protest movement and capturing breathtaking photos and live videos. Ida B. Wells once said, "The way to right the wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." And my promise to you, our readers and our viewers, is that we will continue to document the events taking place around America. And today, as part of that mission, we turn our attention towards solutions. We've gathered leaders, activists, and elected officials to help explore specific issues related to race, law enforcement, and systemic racism in our communities, as well as the policy changes needed to address racial disparities and racial bias. While this crisis is certainly national, change will happen at the local level. And I hope these discussions bring you insight, add value to your conversations, and encourage change in all of our communities. So let's begin. I'd like to introduce North Carolina opinion editor, Peter St. Onge, who will lead today's conversation.
Thank you, KRISTIN. Our editorial board in Charlotte and Raleigh is proud to be a part of the important conversations that North Carolina is having about race. And we're thrilled to welcome the guests who joined us today to talk about systemic racism. We'll be leading off with a conversation with the Reverend Dr. William Barber, followed by a discussion on economic and other structural inequities with BREE NEWSOME and Congresswoman ALMA Adams. Our final segment, which will be hosted by Mike Williams, will be on the intersection of policing, criminal justice, and race. Mike will be talking with Charlotte City Councilman Braxton Winston, historian Melissa Stuckey, and KRISTIE Puckett Williams of the ACLU of North Carolina. But now I'm pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. William Barber. He's the president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. He's also the architect of the Moral Monday marches here in North Carolina that gained national attention in 2013. Reverend Barber is among our country's most resonant and powerful voices on race. Author and philosopher Cornel West said of him, "William Barber is the closest person we have to Martin Luther King Jr. in our midst." I'm pleased he's here with us today. Reverend Barber, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks. So I want to start by asking you to compare this moment we're in now in the wake of George Floyd's death and the conversations that we're having on race with where we were back in 2013 when the Moral Monday marches began. What's different now and what's not different?
Well, I think that, first of all, I like to say that this is, yes, what happened to George Floyd, but this is also a moment where we have COVID going on. We have over 130,000 people who are dying, and we had a report that came out recently from Columbia, 60 to 65% of the people who are dying didn't have to die if we had acted differently in this country from the federal government down. We also know that this COVID is having a disproportionate impact on Black people, brown people, and women and the poor. And we also, before all of this happened, we knew we had 40 million poor and low wealth people in this country, 61% of which are African American, 66 million of which are white, and 700 people dying a day from poverty. So what we have is the confluence of all of these issues. And George Floyd's death, when he was killed, it wasn't just his death. It was the fact that we saw the entire thing on film. And people watched it, and many of them were home, they were watching it, they weren't working as normal, they would be outside of COVID. And when he said, "I can't breathe," his "I can't breathe" became shorthand in a way for a lot of people are feeling. People who are being forced to work in lethal environments, "I can't breathe." People who are dying from COVID that didn't need to, many of them, their last words, "I can't breathe." And the officer of the law who did it so casually, so brazenly, represented the state, and the state is not supposed to kill us. The state is supposed to be about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think that what I would say that is different in this moment is that we saw this level of death on camera in this moment. But I do not separate that moment from Moral Monday, from the earlier protest of Black Lives Matter, from the rise of the women's movement, from the rise of the climate justice movement, because all of these help lay the foundation. The George Floyd death is kind of like the Emmett Till death. There was a lot of work before Emmett Till died, but when his mother opened that casket and forced America to see it, it was there that Rosa Parks and others saw his death and said, we must do more than just go after the people who killed him. We must, in fact, change the systems that killed him, not just the who, but the what, as Dr. King would say. So we're in a moment now where people of all different race, creeds, and colors who've been working together for a long time recognize this as a seminal moment where we must have structural change in America. It's about police violence, but it's also about death and all the other forms of policy violence that are contrary to our deepest values in this country.
I'm glad you mentioned systems, because when we invited people to register for this event, we also asked them to send in questions, and a good many who did wanted to know more about systemic racism. Specifically, they wanted to know exactly what systemic racism was and why it's important to explore it. So I hope you can speak on that for us.
When you talk about racism, that is a powerful piece. You have to talk about systems. It's not about sentimental attitudes. It is about policies that have a disparate impact on people of color. So when you talk about systemic racism historically, you have to talk about the racism that was perpetrated against First Nation people, indigenous people, the genocide of what people we call Indians, but really were indigenous. You have to talk about the racism that happened in slavery. Slavery was a system rooted in greed, rooted in false religion, and rooted in economics and violence. You have to talk about Jim Crow. You have to talk about the racism that happened against people like the Chinese people. We have to talk about racism against brown people, Latinos. It is the systems. And when we say systems, we're saying those systems may be in place, and persons nowadays may never even use the N-word. They may never say, I'm doing this because I hate African Americans, but the impact of the system has a disparate impact on Black people and brown people, people of color. So for instance, in North Carolina, in 2013, the State General Assembly passed a racist voter suppression law, House Bill 589. They never said the N-word. They never said, in fact, they said they were doing it to protect the voters. But when that bill was examined in the courts, when it was examined under the light of the microscope of the Constitution, it was found that in fact it was intentional racism. It was designed specifically to undermine the voting power of Black people, but it also hurt Latino people, it also hurt women, and it also hurt students. And the courts ruled that it was surgical racism. So racism systemic means you have to look at every policy. When healthcare is denied, if it has a disparate impact on Black people and brown people, that's systemic racism. When living wages are denied, particularly in a state that has more than 4 million poor and low-wealth people in this state. When healthcare is denied and living wages are denied, and you examine the impact on people of color, if it has a disparate impact, that's racism. Racism is resegregation of our public schools. Racism is mass incarceration. Racism is violence, police violence. Racism is the injustices toward our immigrant brothers and sisters. Racism is the continuous mistreatment of indigenous people. Systems, that's what systemic racism is. How these various systems and structures have a disparate impact on Black and brown people, people of color, and it undermines this principle, equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment. Whenever equal protection under the law is violated and undermined, it is in fact a deep antithesis to our Constitution and our fundamental values.
A lot of these built-in inequities that you're talking about were revealed again or exposed again with the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm curious what you think about the White House response to that and the congressional response to the pandemic.
Terrible, lethal, inept. You know, I have a core group of public health officials, one from Harvard, one from Drexel, one from UCLA, and they advised the Poor People's Campaign. And if you think about even before COVID, this administration was working to cut the Affordable Care Act. Instead of moving toward making sure everybody has health care, we're the only nation in this country of the 25 wealthiest nations that does not provide health care for all of its citizens, health care that is connected to our bodies and not to our jobs. And when you look at this administration that has tried to cut and undermine healthcare before COVID, when you look at even in the state of North Carolina, our legislature that has denied 500,000 people the Affordable Care Act, 500,000, 346,000, by the way, who are white. And I want to make that point. Racism is targeted at Black people, but it also it ends up hurting white people as well, because those, for instance, who use racist voter suppression to get elected, once they get elected, they block health care, they block living wages, and they do it in a way that hurts in raw numbers more white people and in percentage more Black people. But this administration in COVID was inept. We have modules in all of our universities that they have simulations on how to deal with a virus. Instead of doing that, they lied, just like Woodrow Wilson lied, who was a racist in 1919, about the swine flu. They didn't take it seriously. They tried to undermine it. They didn't put in place the things to track it so that we could mitigate it. And then when the Congress passed bills, the first 3 bills that they passed, even though they know that this virus is hurting poor people and Black people and brown people and low-wage workers, what we call essential workers now, more than anybody, what did they do? 84% of all the money went to banks and corporations. 84% of the money. Overnight, they found 1.2 trillion, almost $2 trillion to go to corporations to uphold them. But then still, there's not been one bill for essential workers that has said we're going to guarantee health care for essential workers. We're going to guarantee sick leave for essential workers. We're going to guarantee unemployment for essential workers. We're going to guarantee more forgiveness of your rent. And we're going to guarantee moratoriums on the water cutoffs and utilities cutoffs. All of the essentials that people needed. So we call people essential, but we don't give them the essentials they need, so they feel like they're expendable. And all of these actions have had a disparate impact on Black people, brown people, women, and the poor. It is a terrible response to this pandemic. And if you think about it, going back to George Floyd, before he ever was lynched and strangled on camera by that rogue cop and those other ones, before that ever happened, he had COVID. He lost his job. He didn't have sufficient unemployment. He didn't have sufficient sick leave. He went to Minnesota to try to find a job. He got an essential job without the essentials that he needed. So when he was on that street corner, he was already being suffocated by the state before that racist cop finished him and killed him. And that is one of the reasons I believe his death has sparked so much, because, as I said, his "I can't breathe" is shorthand for how so many people are feeling. And even his life exposed the failure of our response. 60%, 70% of these deaths, says Columbia University, didn't have to happen. People didn't have to die this way. But when the government doesn't care, doesn't work properly, when the president is more interested in lying than people living, then what we end up with is what we have now.
So we have a smart young Black columnist here in Charlotte named Justin Perry, who wrote a little bit about this just this past week. He said, yes, we've toppled statues, but what we really need to start toppling are statutes and laws. And specifically, he was writing about what local governments can do about policing and housing, and what the North Carolina state lawmakers can do about Medicaid expansion. So I'm curious what your legislative priorities are. I know that the Poor People's Campaign has a platform. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Well, it's interesting. I actually said that in a speech about 2 years ago. It's not statutes, or statutes is statutes. So maybe he borrowed a little bit of that, or maybe I borrowed it from him. But I made that comment in a major speech a few years ago. But it is right. When you deal with racism, it's not just about, do I have a Black friend? It's not just about symbolism. It has to be about substance. And we have to realize that these statutes that were put up in the late 1800s and then up until around 1950. And every time a new statute was put in place or a new form of racism was put in place, these statues were raised up. The flags, Confederate flags, were flown to represent a certain kind of politics, especially in what we call the white Southern strategy, where Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms and people like that decided that they were going to create a way to talk about racism in public policy without sounding racist. And Lee Atwater said the language they used was tax cuts, forced busing, states' rights, and all of the code words that they would use in order to get elected, in order to scare poor and low-income white people who should be the natural allies of poor and low-income Black people. And they wanted to make sure, particularly in the South, poor and low-income Black people and white people never got together because they could fundamentally change the country. And so when you ask, what is the question, what are the issues? First of all, if we're going to be a democracy, you can go to www.poorpeoplescampaign.org and see our entire moral platform for the healing of the nation. But we have to deal with voter suppression. There should be no voter suppression. We have to fully restore the Voting Rights Act and expand it. You can't have a democracy without protecting the right to vote. We have to address resegregation of our public schools and underfunding of our public schools. We have to address mass incarceration and police violence and have full reform in those areas. We have to have a more just way of welcoming our immigrants, particularly our brown immigrants, from Latino immigrants, and those from the mother country of Africa. We have to address the way in which indigenous people are still living under oppressive treaties that we broke, and we have to fix that issue. We have to address poverty. We must put in place a living wage, at least $15, and a union across this country. If we did that, we would automatically raise 49 million people out of poverty and low wealth, and we would add $368 billion to the economy. We have to address the issue of making sure that the poor of the poorest have access to the things they need for fundamental humanity and living. We have to make sure we have health care. There are 80 million people in this country who are either underinsured or uninsured. That is not a democracy. That is not establishing justice. We must address ecological devastation and the way in which poor Black and brown communities are devastated by corporate polluters. We must change that. We must address the war economy, where we spend 54 cents of every discretionary dollar in the war economy and less than 16 cents of every discretionary dollar in education and healthcare and living wages. And we must address the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that basically says if you're against gay people, if you're against women's right to choose, if you're for guns and for a Republican Party, then somehow that's a godly position, rather than saying what you should be as a people of faith is for justice, for ending racism, for ending poverty, for ending the war economy, because Jesus said that how we treat the poor and the least of these is really how faith is looked at. And we have to dig deep, lastly, into our fundamental constitutional values. I preached a sermon, lastly, a few weeks ago at the National Cathedral, and the sermon was entitled, America, Death is No Longer Acceptable. It's not acceptable anymore. And the basis of that sermon was that racism and classism have a death measurement, that wherever there is racism, if you scratch a racist, you'll find a thief. A person that's a racist toward Black people, system that is racist toward Black and brown people will steal your health care, will steal your living wages, will steal your clean environment. And the reality is racist policies rooted in economic injustice have a death measurement. Poverty kills, lack of living wages kills, lack of health care kills. And we must decide in this country that we're going to live into our first promise of this democracy, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And both in scripture, theology tells us we're to stand against systems of death, but the very Declaration of Independence says anytime a government there's been a long train of abuses against life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the people have the right to alter that government. It is time for us to address the long train of abuses and take every piece of public policy and examine it and see if that piece of public policy has a disparate impact on Black people, brown people, people of color, and poor people. And if it produces death, not just the death we see on cameras, but the death in the back rooms and the hospital rooms that we never see, then we should seek to alter those policies, because ultimately this democracy is supposed to be about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Reverend Barber, I have one final question, and this one came in some form or another from several readers, but this one in particular from Kim McCombs, viewers, from Kim McCombs. One role for white people is to be a good ally. What does being a good ally look like to you?
Well, you know, I hear a lot now about we're seeing white people involved in the movement, and it's so marvelous. Let me give one corrector to that. There has been no major moral movement, no major justice movement against racism that Black and white people have not fought together. Let's make sure we're being historically accurate. You would not have had the abolition movement without Harriet Tubman and Lucretia Mott, a white Quaker, and the founder of Guilford College up in Greensboro. You would not have had it without William Lloyd Garrison, a white preacher, and Frederick Douglass. You would not have had the NAACP in its beginning. The first two presidents of executive secretaries of the NAACP were white. In fact, the first three were white. And the majority of the board were white and Black people together. It was W.B. Du Bois, and it was also a white woman social worker. You would not have had those who were pushing in the union movement without Black and white people together. There was no such thing as a civil rights movement without Black and white people together. The problem is we often have shortened that history and haven't told that history. There's a whole history of how even before Rosa Parks sat down, Black and white people in Montgomery were planning for the day. There's a whole history of how it was happening in Selma. Go back and look at the pictures, we see it. Even the early Black Lives Matter movement, you saw Black and white people that needed and talk about it as much. The Moral Monday movement, though I was, kind of the leader of it with so many other people, a servant leader of it. Go back and look at all those pictures. 65% of the people that got arrested in the Moral Monday movement were white. 65% of the people were white. And there were Black people, we all were working together. And that's why we won. That's why we beat back voter suppression. When we filed our suit against voter suppression in North Carolina, we had the NAACP, the Women's League, students, and Latinos. So what must we do? What we have always done, and even more. We need deeply moral, intersectional movements where people, white and Black and brown and red and yellow and gay and straight and trans and young and old, people of faith, people not of faith, Jewish, Muslims, Christians, all of us come together who are sick and tired of the rejection, sick and tired of racism, sick and tired of classism, sick and tired of this society catering to the greedy and not to those who are needy, sick and tired of so much of the wealth going to one direction when the people are in fact the makers of the wealth, and know that we can do better. And we come together and we stand together in an agenda. That's why the Poor People's Campaign is counterintuitive. We have white coal miners working together with Black folk from the Mississippi Delta. We have Kansas farmers connected to Black people who are fast food workers in North Carolina. We have people in Maine working together with people in Mississippi, people in California working together with people in Virginia. We have an Apache Nation and Navajo people working together with union leaders in Ohio. It's going to take us all. I just wrote a little book entitled, We Are Called to Be a Movement. Who's the we? Everybody's been rejected by racism and classism and homophobia and chauvinism and sexism, all of the isms. We have to be together. And so, yes, white people need to be the allies. We need to be together, but don't act as though that is new. That's all I want people to understand. History shows us that every time we have come together, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth were just as strong in the women's suffrage movement as they were in the anti-slavery movement. Even though they knew the first law would only provide white women the right to vote, they knew that once they broke through and made it so that white women had to have the right to vote, it wasn't going to be long that they could break through and all people would have the right to vote. Fusion moral politics. And lastly, in North Carolina, never forget the 1800s, from 1868 to 1896, when black and white fusionists, former slaves and freedmen, and the poor white people worked together in North Carolina to transform this state. This state was ahead of the United States passing an equal protection under the law. This state made education a constitutional right, and we still don't have it as a constitutional right in the federal constitution. How did that happen? When black and white people came together right after slavery, poor blacks, poor former slaves, poor whites, and said, listen, we can do better, and we will do better. And they rewrote our Constitution. I close with this quote. This is what black and white people did in 1868. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons, not men, all persons are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what black and white people did in 1868. Lastly, they wrote in Article 11 of the Constitution, they said, beneficent treatment of uplifting the poor, I'm paraphrasing, uplifting the poor and benevolent treatment to the least of these is the first duty, not second duty, of a civilized and Christian state. That's what happens when we come together. They did it in the 1800s. We do it now. We'll turn this country around.
Reverend Barber, thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being here and sharing your time with us. Thanks very much.
God bless you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Our second panel today is on economic and other structural inequities. Let's welcome our guest. BREE NEWSOME Bass captured the national spotlight in 2015 when, in the wake of the shooting of 9 Charleston parishioners, she climbed the flagpole at the South Carolina State House and pulled down the Confederate flag. NEWSOME is an accomplished artist, and she continues to be a strong, thoughtful voice on injustice and racial discrimination. BREE, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Congresswoman ALMA Adams is serving her 3rd full term representing the 12th Congressional District of North Carolina. She's quickly established herself in the House as an advocate for minority populations, including historically Black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. Congresswoman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So I have a question for you both. A lot of the conversation about systemic racism today is centered on policing, and rightfully so. But what do we need to be talking about more when we're talking about systemic racism and how it impacts Black people's lives? BREE?
Yes. So, I think that Reverend Barber in that segment, he laid it out very well in terms of explaining racism as a system, right, of laws and policies that are designed to oppress and to concentrate wealth and power among a few and to keep the majority of people constantly struggling, right? I think the reason that policing is always a flashpoint in like what we have seen here in the past month or so is because police are really tasked by the state with being the daily enforcers of a law that is unjust. So let's look, for instance, at the housing situation. We have been in a housing crisis for some time now, and it is only ballooning under the circumstances with the pandemic. So we are looking at a circumstance of potentially thousands of people facing eviction just here in the state of North Carolina, millions of people across the nation possibly facing eviction. If those people are forced out of their homes, who shows up to force them out? It's the police who get called. And so we have to really look at not just the police forces, right, as a source of violence, but the laws that they are called upon to enforce, because that is really the source of structural racism. Housing has always been fundamentally racist in its organization. We know, of course, that Black people, Latinos, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, queer and trans communities, anyone who is marginalized by the systems and structures of this nation are also discriminated against in housing. And housing is one of the most basic things that you need in order to survive and thrive, right, as a human being. the pandemic has also exposed that housing is not just an economic issue, but really is a public health and safety issue. We have issues of people who are being forced to shelter in place in conditions that may not be safe. We have people who are being issued stay-at-home orders, but they have no homes to stay in, to be safe in, right? And so that's why people like myself, we are really calling for guaranteed housing, that housing is a human right. This is something that everyone needs in order to survive. And it is something that, especially in the wealthiest nation on earth, there is no excuse for people being without housing under normal circumstances, but particularly right now where we are facing a pandemic and an economic downturn, we should not have so many millions of people wondering if they are going to be able to pay their rent next month or what they're going to do if they can't.
Thank you. Congresswoman Adams, what do you think? What should we be talking about more with systemic racism and how it affects Black people?
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter, for the invitation to McClatchy and the Charlotte Observer as well. I have to say amen to Reverend Barber, who he and I have had a long relationship, and BREE, I have admired you and your work as well. But, you know, when we talk about systemic racism, it's really limiting opportunities for folks who are born Black in this society. And certainly the systems have given unjust amount of resources and rights and power to white folks while denying them to people of color. So I want to point out that this renewed push for racial justice comes at the time when we face this pandemic, as has been said, that disproportionately affects Black and brown Americans. So when we look at it in terms of the criminal justice system, this virus has shown us another example of what systemic racism looks like. You know, we've heard in our African American community so much that when white folks catch a cold, Black folks get pneumonia. So the effects of this virus have made it clear beyond a doubt. Now, when we look at the fact that we've had this brutal murder of George Floyd, it has opened up the light on this epidemic of police misconduct, with over 5,000 people killed in the past 5 years. So it seems like we hear a new name and every day, and some of these folks are very young. Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, Tamira Rice, who was only 12. But anyway, I've seen the names all over our community. The epidemic does hit home. Since 2000, over 50 people have been killed by police right here in Mecklenburg County, and that's probably an underestimate. So I would want to think that the people killed by police in this county includes young people that probably as young as 17 and 16. So if you could imagine how many of these killings didn't have to happen, how many years of life we could have given back to the men, the women, and the children. So I think we've got to have a whole of government response to it. We are now looking at a system where we are examining policing, and I think that it's about really reimagining what policing is all about.
So Bree, this movement and momentum that we're seeing now on race, you know, the hope for many is that will manifest itself in November's election, and that's how change can kind of truly start. But you think that we shouldn't wait that long. And in a real interesting tweet thread this week, you said we need to shut everything down and demand the adequate resourcing of our communities now. Talk to me about why now is the time and how that might happen.
Yes, well, I mean, I think the reality is just that the legislative calendar, the election calendar doesn't have anything to do with the reality of how people are living. Right now, people are not sure how they are going to pay August's rent, right? The unemployment insurance is running out. In North Carolina, we have had a moratorium on eviction, but there's no guarantee that that is going to last. Representative Adams is my representative, and she is one of the Congress people that does advocate on behalf of the people. But by and large, Congress has not been responsive to the amount of urgency that we have in this moment. And that's why I'm very supportive of the workers who are going on strike right now. I'm very supportive of the calls for rent strike, because if we wait until after the election, until after we have a new president and a new Congress, we're looking at 6 months from now. So we will be well into potentially the second wave of the COVID outbreak. 6 months from now, who knows how many people will be evicted from their homes. The crisis that we are in right now is not anything that we can wait on. Unfortunately, we do not have right now a government that is functioning to the extent that we need, a government that is really meeting the demands of this crisis with a genuine public health response. There seems to be more of a focus on how do we protect the profits of those who are already extremely wealthy, where average households are trying to figure out how to get by on just $600 a month. Some of them do not even know when or if they will be able to go back to work. So the urgency is now. Like, we need for Congress and for all of our leaders to give the people the same kind of bailouts that they were willing to give the airlines. As soon as the crisis unfolded, like when it became very clear the level of crisis that we were facing, the first people in line to get handouts were major corporations, the airlines, billionaires, people who already have funds. And we see this happen time and time again. And that's why I'm saying, and of course, I'm not the only person that's saying it, I just agree with everyone who is saying that this has to stop now. We simply cannot wait. I think people completely understand everything that is at stake. People are absolutely committed to turning out and voting. That is a settled matter. But people need to know what's going to happen so that people can survive from now to November. That is not even guaranteed that we can make it to November.
Yeah.
Congresswoman Adams, what do you think about that? What can Congress do now?
Well, I certainly agree with BREE. You know, when we were talking about the fact that so many African Americans were victimized by the COVID, that more of our folks were getting affected, more of them were dying, and then it exposed all of these systems. The fact that the healthcare is not there, the fact that there are many ailments that we may have that we can't address because there's no healthcare. I agree that we cannot wait. I am hoping certainly that people have a sense of urgency. I think government needs to have it. That's one of the reasons why we passed the HEROES Act and all of the stimulus packages that we did, because we do believe that there is a fierce urgency of now, and we've got to address these issues. We can't wait. I've heard so many people say, well, after the pandemic, we're going to do this and do that. Well, we're not sure when the pandemic is going to be over, but we certainly know that people need to have access to health care, that they need to have access to clean, safe, affordable housing. I had a constitutional amendment that I was trying to get through to say that housing should be a basic need. So should health care. So should having the kind of food and having a good job, a good paying job. Working hard is not enough if you don't make enough. So yes, we've got to work on these issues right now, because as BREE has said, we may not get to make those decisions in November, but I'm certainly hope that people will feel this urgency of now to make sure that in the future, as we look at who we're going to elect to office, I've said, you don't change policy sometimes until you change policy makers. If you can't change their mind, then you have to change some people. But yes, I agree. We don't need to be putting things off. We can address a lot of these problems and situations right now. And I think we have a responsibility as elected people to really address it, and address it head on, admit that there's a problem. Certainly COVID has shown us, and even before COVID, we've known. Black folks have always known. People, Black and brown people have always known. We have always experienced this. But now everybody has an opportunity to see it. And I think we've got to work together collectively with the local, the state, and the federal level to make these things come to pass.
So a final question for you both. You've both been a part of or observed other moments and movements regarding race. Some have resulted in more meaningful change. How optimistic are each of you at this moment that it's going to lead to meaningful change? Representative Adams.
Well, I'm a pretty optimistic person, and I think that because I support the protesters. I think that's exactly what needed to happen. I certainly support the issues that are on the table. I do think I support the right to protest. I think it is we've got to really control some of these agents that they're putting out there, and so I have a bill that hopefully will do that. But I am convinced that because the covers have pulled back, I'm convinced that, as Black Americans, as people of color, we're sick and tired of getting sicker than the rest of America. I believe that things are going to get better because I don't think that the federal government, I don't think the state government or even local government can stand and by and not get involved right now. And I think the people are insisting on it. The fact that, and I'm so happy to see so many young people out here. I'm so glad to see that we have people of all races, all ethnicities, all religions, and so forth coming together because, as has been said earlier, that's exactly what we need to do. So I am, this time is different. I've been around for a very long time. The Lord's blessed me. I've seen a lot of protests. I've been involved in a number of them. But this time is different. There is a fierce urgency of now, and I think the people have felt it. They're making politicians feel it, and I think that as a result, we're going to see change. We're going to demand it. The folks out here marching and working are demanding that elected officials stand up and not just talk about it, but be about it.
Bree, what do you think? Is this time different?
I think it is different. And that is why I am optimistic that there will be some real change now. I think that what we are seeing is the compounded effects of a lot of issues, a lot of problems that have, frankly, we've been kicking the can down the road for generations. And I think it's just reached a point where we can no longer do that. And you have people who, were maybe even comfortable enough, they may have cared, but, they weren't feeling vulnerable enough under the system to maybe get out in the street and protest or to risk losing anything. But now so many people are losing their jobs. This is a situation that is impacting everyone, and no one is really safe or immune to it. And I think that is why we are seeing a real ground shift. And I think, too, that people are seeing that it's got to be more than just voting. Yes, voting is important. Yes, electing leadership is important, but there has to be a shift in the values, right? Because in order to really change the structures and the systems, there has to be a shifting in our culture, in our values. I think Martin Luther King said it very well about moving from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, right? The response that we have been getting from leadership to the pandemic has been very thing-oriented, right? How much money can we continue making? Where's the stock market looking like? Can we open up businesses? It's not a people-centered response. And what we are all seeing in this moment is that society is completely intertwined. None of us exist in a silo, right? The health and well-being of the most vulnerable among us impacts the health and well-being of the whole society because we don't have things in place like secured housing and healthcare, well-funded schools. That's why we are facing these compounded crises. And even if you are a person who right now, has enough food, has enough housing, and is stable enough, you are still facing the downturn that the entire nation is taking. You can't be immune to that. And I think that all of that, kind of compounded together is why there is this shift, this like major swing in opinion, even from just 5 years ago on these same topics. I mean, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement didn't begin with George Floyd. This has been going on for a number of years now. But what happened was people realized, you know what, I may have before thought that I didn't have a stake in this, but I absolutely do. I mean, again, back to what Reverend Barber said so well, racism disproportionately impacts people, but it impacts everyone. And that's the reality of it. And we can't have liberty for everyone. We can't have life for everyone. We can't have the pursuit of happiness for everyone until we truly guarantee that everyone is entitled to human rights and dignity in this nation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that this is all the time we have for this panel. It's been great. I appreciate you both being here. BREE, NEWSOME, Bass, ALMA, Adams, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's my pleasure to introduce my co-moderator, Mike Williams. Mike is the founder of the Black on Black Project, which brings artists together across North Carolina to unpack issues that are important to our communities. And Mike's going to host a third panel on criminal justice, policing, and race. Mike, thanks for being here.
All right. Thank you, Peter. We're excited to continue this conversation. We continue to see examples in 2020 that show the relationship between law enforcement and the Black community is tenuous at best. Since Memorial Day, we've seen communities across this great state of North Carolina demand change, and it seems our nation as a whole is at another breaking point. And as Dr. Barber said earlier, part of demanding systemic change is understanding the origins of systems and how they work. And in our brief time today, we'll have a conversation that I believe will begin to do just that. Joining us for our final segment, we have Dr. Melissa Stuckey, Assistant Professor of History, Elizabeth City State University. KRISTIE Puckett Williams, Statewide Campaign for Smart Justice Manager for the ACLU of North Carolina. And Jackson Winston, Charlotte City Council Member at Large. Thank you all for joining us. And I want to jump right in and get to this historical context for this very, very important conversation when we're looking at policing of the Black community. So Dr. Stuckey, talk a little bit about that history in terms of slave patrols in the United States. When did they first pop up and what was the purpose?
Thank you for having me. So when we think about policing of Black bodies, it certainly begins during slavery with slave patrols, as you mentioned. And these were designed to make sure that Black people essentially stayed in their place. They didn't wander, they didn't visit, they didn't congregate off of plantations when they were not working. So in the evenings. What's important about that is to really think about what that means. Black people were not supposed to get together outside of the surveillance, outside of the watchful eye of white authority on a plantation. And that concept continues after the Civil War, right? So the biggest concerns, one of the biggest concerns that white people, not just former Confederates, but also the federal government through the US Army have, is the idea of free Black people moving about in the public space without being controlled by others. So laws that are vagrant laws that are just about people congregating, getting together and not being employed, those kinds of things, which are about freedom of movement. So we're really talking about fundamental freedoms that are within the Constitution and how those things have been denied Black people and used against them. So laws used to control their space, control how they work, where they work, when they work, and how they enjoy leisure time. So when I think about someone like George Floyd or, thinking about Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown, people who are moving in the public space and are being surveilled, Ahmaud Arbery moving in the public space and being surveilled and ultimately being killed because they are refusing to be controlled, right? Refusing to listen to an authority figure or purported authority figure that's telling them what to do with their bodies. That's something that is part of policing. And it's not just about race, although race is a central component of it, especially in the South. These are things that impact poor people all over the nation as well. And, we can think more broadly to think about women as well in terms of control, people who want to control the bodies of others.
Yeah, in the book, Slave Patrols, Law and Violence in Virginia and the Carolinas, Professor and historian Sally Haddon writes this. She says, most law enforcement was, by definition, white patrolmen watching, catching, and beating Black slaves. So KRISTIE, you're someone who's been out there in the streets in Charlotte with the protesters every day. You were even hit with rubber bullets and even arrested. So when you think about this, this notion that Haddon is submitting here about how Black folks in neighborhoods are policed today, do you think that that is something that affects how that happens, how we are policed today?
Sure. I mean, you know, the best predictor for future behavior is past behavior, and the police are doing what they have done historically. And they may make some changes, they may recalibrate, but basically what they are doing is brutalizing Black people. We've saw that across this country. We've seen that forever in this country. And we are protesting police brutality. And the response to that protest is to use brutality against people who are exercising their constitutional rights. The violence at the hands of the police is about not so much about law, but it's about order. It is about, as I think it's Dr. Stuckey said, it is about controlling how, where, and when Black people show up. We were not supposed to show up on Beatties Ford Road on May 29th, excuse me, when I was initially arrested. I was not supposed to show up on 277 a few weeks later when I was arrested again. So it is about order and maintaining that order at the expense of Black people.
Yeah, Councilman Winston, when you think about the civil rights movement of the 60s and all the peaceful protests, we see how law enforcement interacted with them. And most people think about Bloody Sunday, you know, March 7, 1965. I bring that up because you were somebody just like KRISTIE, who was on Beatties Ford Road May 29th and joined protesters, and you were arrested for failing to disperse. And then a few weeks later, you wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, and this is what you said. Policing in America is a carefully curated system embedded in racism, classism, sexism, and homophobia. Unpack that statement a little bit more for us, and then talk about your experience being arrested by the Charlotte-Mecklenburg PD.
Well, I think the current posture of most, if not all, American police forces are a confluence of so many of the topics that Dr. BARBER, BREE, Representative Adams, and KRISTIE is now touching on. When you talk about that control, while it is manifested through the state, we are still a country based in democratic principles, a country made of and by and for the people. And for far too long, there has been a small segment of people that understand how to use the tools of government. And particularly around policing, they have used those tools because of these systems of racism, classism, sexism, this fear of others to control the other. And we have each allowed for that to happen because we are Americans. We have to figure out ways to take more control of our government and manifest the policies and practices for the type of societies, the beloved communities that we actually want. Look, we know when a house is on fire, we call the fire department. When somebody is having a medical emergency, you call an emergency medical technician. However, when people are uncomfortable, have an emotional reaction to somebody on the street, when somebody is having a situation where they are in mental crisis or there is a social crisis, people have demanded, people that have the political capital and the political power, not that those specialists respond to those calls if a response is even necessary, but those law enforcement communities respond to do what KRISTIE said, control the other that we are afraid of.
Yeah, Dr. Stuckey, when you think about the other and some of the ways that these images of propaganda were dispersed after the Civil War, specifically maybe during Reconstruction, let's think about policing during that time frame, vagrancy laws, black codes, etc. Break down law enforcement after the Civil War.
Sure. Well, after the Civil War, again, this is about controlling people's movements. The economic structure after the Civil War in the American South in particular was profoundly stratified. African Americans were denied opportunities to own land. They were primarily sharecroppers. They were denied opportunities to get education, certainly satisfactory education or quality education. And they were treated as a distinct class within the law. So sentencing structures were such that Black people would be sentenced for longer prison terms for minor crimes in comparison to their white compatriots. They were certainly policed in terms of where they could live, where they could be. And I really want to emphasize that, right? This is about the simple act of being. Where can you be? What neighborhoods can you be in? Who can you associate with? So freedom of association, again, all of these freedoms that are foundational to the nation were ones that were curtailed, if not outright denied to African Americans, not just through the policing structure, although that was the extension, that was the arm that made the that actually enforced it. But we're talking about city codes, we're talking about state law, and we're talking about federal malfeasance. The federal government did not have an investment in protecting African American citizens from these transgressions by the state, by the local community.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring those things up because, some of us are here in North Carolina, and, this was a hotbed for civil rights activity for a long time, all the way back to 1898, all the way up through the 60s and even today. And KRISTIE, when you hear things like when the looting starts, the shooting starts, we know that's a throwback term. The police chief in Miami in 1967 was somebody who used that. But when you hear that term today, how do you think that affects an already tense relationship between law enforcement and the Black community?
Well, it reminds me of what our former chief said after the June 2nd Kettling incident, that if CMPD could no longer use less than lethal force against protesters, then we would go back to days of beating protesters with billy clubs. So the use of force and the use of what the police define as less than lethal weapons or less than lethal ways of controlling a crowd have always existed and will always continue to exist. It continues to disconnect us from the police and the police from the community. But we just have to say that, number one, policing is not legitimate. Like policing is an illegitimate way to get what we say we need in order to get to public safety. Despite us incarcerating more people than anywhere else in the world, crime has not gone down, right? And so policing and incarceration is not a response to crime. And we keep holding people and individuals accountable, and we never really hold the system accountable for the violence that it perpetuates, sustains, maintains, all of that creates. And so the impact is that the people will always bear the brunt of the force that the system and that systemic racism creates. The people will always bear the brunt of that. Black people especially will bear the brunt of that. And if they are Black and trans, they will definitely be the most marginalized. And so if we really want to get to the safety that we say we want, we have to protect our most marginalized community members. And once they are safe, we'll always be safe. But we're not going to get there with police or policing or social order control or anything like that. We get there by providing people with what we've heard in earlier segments, which is what they need. People need a house. People need to work and earn money. People need to feel good about living every day. And where we are right now is we work really hard and we feel really bad. And so that's what we are seeing, the response that you see across the country. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and it's not just Black folks no more.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We work really hard and we're tired of feeling bad after working really hard. So we understand, what happened to this point and sort of how we got here. We sort of laid that foundation. So let's shift briefly to what change looks like. And Councilman, I got to come to you. What's the government's role in keeping its citizens safe?
Well, I think when we specifically talk about COVID, I think there are three things right now, right? We know people need a home. People need to be able to have access to food and so they can survive. And they need access to medical care. So all of that, being able to ensure that everybody in our community has that would entail us going into systems change, right? Not trying to figure out how you make the system work better for more people while still leaving folks out. We have to change the system. And not any one entity of government or one council member or one vote can do that. But what we are able to do is control our point in the system. So when it comes to the legal system or judicial system, whichever term you want to utilize, yes, cities can't change that whole part, but we can change the response that we are legally responsible to provide when somebody calls 911. Not by sending police or law enforcement entities, maybe create a system of first responders that is needed. When we're talking about the response to COVID, if you go to 12th Street and North College Street in Charlotte, North Carolina, you can see what we should be doing. We have a growing tent city there that doesn't have to be. But if we were to do something, if the city and the county were to go and to do something like dramatically increase the amount of supportive housing or transitional housing, that means we would have to do something different. We would have to look into going and putting our hands on and becoming property owners, perhaps, or developers, and work with each other in ways that our systems don't allow us to work together really well, and to change that system to create new systems that will be responsive now. That's the only way that we move forward. If we are committed to deconstructing the systems that are perpetuating the status quo and building new systems that we know exist. I just want to point out that there have always been cities, there have always been communities way before 1776. Though there have always been governments before 1776. Government has always played a role in keeping people safe. People look up to an order society, a system of morals that govern our interactions with one another. This has been done before, and it can be done again.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make about things that have worked before. Dr. Barber referenced what happened in the fusion movement in here in North Carolina, and Dr. Helen Edmonds wrote a great book about that. KRISTIE, you in other interviews have talked about transformational changes versus transactional changes. In the time we have left, please break that down for us and give us a specific example of each.
Sure. So transactional changes are changes where we do things that look good. They're performative. They're to check the box. For instance, all of our city leadership is Black. That's a transactional change. Just making sure that we have a representation is not enough. We need transformational change. And transformation comes when we, number one, are able to acknowledge and be transparent. So accountability and transparency are the foundations of transformational change. And if we want to see those changes happen, then we have to look at people not just based on their race or their proximity to issues, but also their dedication to those issues. And so are they willing to hear things that make them uncomfortable? Or are they only willing to do things the way they've always been done? Transactional changes represent changing the name of something, but it actually being the same thing. Right. We've seen slavery by another name. We've called slavery all kinds of things other than what it is, like the enslavement of people. And so those are transactional changes. When we change the name of something, when we hire people as tokens, when we do things and post it on our social media, but we don't really do the intentional things of getting to the root of the issue. If we're not looking at the organizational, institutional practices and making sure that those practices are equitable and inclusive, then we're doing transactional things that make us feel good, where we can pat ourselves on the back and say, good job. But that's not actually bringing any real change about.
Dr. Stuckey, from a historical perspective, can you think of a time where systems were reformed, systems that disproportionately targeted specific groups of people? Do we have any precedents for that?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that I would love to emphasize is that the actions that we're seeing in the streets today are part and parcel of how we change society. I was thinking about this morning about the Boston Tea Party. Civil disobedience, which does sometimes include breaking the law, is part and parcel of how our society fundamentally changes. So, between the American Revolution, the Second American Revolution, which is the Civil War, the modern civil rights movement of the 1960s, we are in a moment where we have the opportunity, and we're seizing it, to create profound change, sustained change, and sustainable change in the United States right now. We are at a unique moment because of COVID, right? Because people are sick, people are scared, people are unemployed, people don't have a sense that their economic futures are secure, and we have time. We have time to sit down and think, and time to work together and to really meet meet our needs, right? Meet the needs of our collective. We have a responsibility to do so. I'm a college professor. I've got students who are out in the streets marching, fighting for their futures, recognizing that their futures, even with college degrees, are not protected. They're not guaranteed. They've done the work, they've bought into the system, but they can recognize when we see the confluence of racial violence, police violence against people who look like them, and this pandemic that is destabilizing the economy, they can see that they have to do more to effect change. And it's up to us to meet them where they are and work with them to create a better future for all of us.
Yeah, I'm getting the Grammy music in my ear, but I want to throw one last thing out at you all briefly. If you could have one thing change in terms of policing right now, what would it be? KRISTIE, I'll start with you.
The existence of police, we wouldn't have them at all.
All right, Dr. Stuckey.
I would say creativity, commitment, and care. We can do this differently. It does not have to look the way it does today.
Councilman Winston, last word.
Over 3/4 of the calls for service that our CMPD responds to have no suspicion of criminal activity. I would love to form a first responder network that accurately and specifically engages the needs of my community. And that's what I'm working to do now with the rest of my term.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Melissa Stuckey, Ms. KRISTIE Puckett Williams, and Councilman Braxton Winston. Peter, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of our panelists for their insight today. This is an ongoing conversation, of course, and it's one that will continue on our pages as well with editorials and op-eds from community leaders throughout North Carolina. We hope you join us then, and we appreciate you watching today. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.